My name is Rebecca Moore. I am 35 years old, and for most of my life, I believed that endurance was strength. I told myself that if I stayed calm long enough, if I swallowed enough pain quietly, something would eventually soften, that love would come back if I proved I deserved it. I grew up learning how to read silence, how to measure my worth by the absence of praise. In my family, affection was conditional, given carefully, withdrawn without warning. I became skilled at shrinking, at convincing myself that being overlooked was better than being rejected, and for years, I called that survival. Everything changed on a Christmas night in Hawthorne, Massachusetts, inside my parents' old house, the one everyone admired. 20 guests filled the rooms beneath warm lights and polished wood, laughter echoed against the high ceilings, wine glasses clinked. From the outside, it looked like the perfect family gathering, the kind people envy. Inside me, there was a tightness I couldn't explain, a sense that something was about to break. My father, Richard Moore, stood at the head of the table, his voice steady and commanding, just as it had been my entire life. Even in his 60s, he carried authority effortlessly. He spoke about tradition, about legacy, about the pride of the Moore name. My mother, Evelyn, sat beside him, smiling flawlessly, her hand resting on his arm like a symbol of unity. I sat several seats away, my glass untouched, my shoulders tense. The invitation had arrived weeks earlier, written in my father's handwriting, and that alone had reopened a fragile hope I thought I had buried. Maybe this night would be different. Then his tone shifted. He began talking about the house, the old Moore home built in the late 1800s, the heart of our family history. He spoke about the future, about placing the house where it belonged. As he turned toward my younger sister Clara, glowing in an emerald dress beside her fiancé, the room hummed with approval. My chest tightened. I realized what he was about to do. Before fear could stop me, I spoke. I reminded him calmly that the house was held in trust by our grandmother, that it belonged equally to both grandchildren. The room froze. My father's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing in a way that pulled me straight back into childhood. He warned me not to ruin the evening. I held my ground, said the law mattered, said our grandmother's wishes were clear. What followed wasn't an argument, it was cruelty disguised as entertainment. My mother laughed lightly and suggested I had no future because I had no children. Clara joined in, mocking me openly, calling me a burden, clapping as though my humiliation were a performance. Then my father struck me. The sound of his hand across my cheek cracked through the room, sharp, unmistakable. Everything stopped. Some guests stared into their drinks, others looked away. My mother laughed again, softer this time, almost pleased. Clara applauded. I pressed my palm against my burning cheek and sat upright, refusing to cry, refusing to collapse. And in that moment, clarity settled in. The invitation had never been about reconciliation. I had been brought there as a reminder of who held power and who did not. As conversation slowly resumed, I stared at the Christmas lights reflected in the ornaments. They looked like shards of glass. I understood then that this humiliation hadn't started that night. It had been building my entire life. As I reached for my coat and stepped into the cold December air, snow crunching beneath my boots, I felt something unfamiliar. I was no longer the daughter begging for approval. I was standing at the edge of change, unaware of how far the consequences of that night would spread, but certain of one thing. Nothing would ever be the same again. By the next morning, the humiliation had already escaped the walls of my parents' dining room. It moved faster than the snow falling outside. My phone buzzed nonstop with messages I didn't want to read, missed calls from unfamiliar numbers, voicemails left in hushed, curious tones asking if I was all right. Someone even asked, carefully, if it was true that my father had hit me in front of everyone. Seeing the words written out made my stomach twist. Hawthorne had long memories, and stories like this didn't stay quiet. I tried to outrun it anyway. I drove into Boston and stopped at a small corner cafe near my apartment, hoping a cup of coffee might steady my nerves. While waiting in line, I noticed two women at a nearby table whispering. When one of them looked up and met my eyes, her face flushed. She quickly looked away. Even here, miles from my parents' house, my private pain had become public curiosity. By the time I reached home, my voicemail box was full. Some messages were kind, a coworker saying she had heard rumors and was there if I needed someone. Others were cruel, anonymous voices suggesting I must have deserved it. I held my phone so tightly my fingers ached, then set it down like it was something poisonous. That evening, as snow fell quietly outside my kitchen window, there was a knock at the door. When I opened it, Daniel stood in the hallway, my sister Clara's fiancé, awkward, pale, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. He had always seemed like a shadow trailing behind her, polite but distant. Still, something in his expression looked different, unsettled, almost frightened. He asked if he could come in. Against my better judgment, I let him. He stood near the counter, shifting his weight, apologizing for what had happened. I told him flatly that an apology didn't undo a slap heard by an entire room. He rubbed his forehead and said there were things I didn't know, things my parents and Clara had been telling people, that I had turned my back on the family, that I refused to help when times were hard. My chest tightened. They had never asked me for help. They had only taken, mocked, and demanded silence. Daniel looked at me then and said they would never ask directly. It was easier to paint me as selfish than admit they were desperate. When I demanded why he was telling me this, he hesitated, said he had seen my face when my father hit me, said it was wrong, and that things were worse than I realized. He wouldn't explain more. He only warned me to be careful, repeating it like a plea, then left quickly, as if afraid someone might be watching. After he left, the apartment felt colder. His warning echoed in the quiet. Be careful of what? Be careful of whom? The next day, the whispers followed me again. At a grocery store near my apartment, I overheard two older women talking loudly near the produce section. One wondered how my husband must feel being married to a woman who couldn't give him children, who had humiliated her father at Christmas. The words hit so hard I dropped the strawberries I was holding. They scattered across the floor like spilled blood. The women stared at me, one with pity, the other with judgment. My throat tightened until breathing hurt. That night, I sat alone in my kitchen with the lights dimmed, holding the vintage pocket watch I had bought for my father, a gift he never opened. My fingers traced its engraved edge. It felt like a relic from a version of myself I no longer recognized, the woman who believed effort could earn belonging. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Megan, my childhood friend who still lived in Hawthorne. She said she had heard what happened and wanted to talk. When I called her, her voice was steady, grounding. She told me the town was buzzing, that Clara was spreading the story deliberately, saying I refused to help the family financially, that I looked down on them. Then Megan's tone shifted. She said she'd heard whispers that my father's construction business was in trouble, deep trouble, and that Clara was telling people I was cutting ties so I wouldn't be dragged down with them. The words settled heavily in my chest. For the first time since Christmas, I stopped asking how to earn their love, and started asking what they were trying to hide. The same night, long after the call with Megan ended, I sat alone at my kitchen table, the city lights glowing faintly through the window. Her words replayed in my head: trouble, debt, desperation. I thought of my father's face at Christmas, the tension beneath his confidence, the urgency in his voice when he spoke about the house. For the first time, his cruelty looked less like power and more like panic. I stared at my phone for a long time before opening my contacts, scrolling past names I hadn't touched in years, until I stopped at one I hadn't called since my 20s. Henry Lawson, my father's former business partner. When I was a child, he had felt like an uncle, slipping me candy during long afternoons at the office. My father had cut ties with him abruptly, claiming Henry was slowing the company down. Back then, I had believed him. Now, I wondered if Henry had simply known too much. I pressed call before I could overthink it. The line rang twice, then a pause after I said my name, followed by a slow sigh. He said he'd been expecting to hear from me. Everyone in town had heard about Christmas, he said. Small towns never forget. His voice held an old gentleness that made something inside my chest ache. When I told him I believed my father was hiding something about the business, he didn't sound surprised. He asked me to come see him the next morning, early, and told me to bring nothing but myself. I barely slept that night. My thoughts spun in restless circles, imagining conversations I wasn't ready to have, truths I wasn't ready to face. At dawn, frost clung to the trees as I drove out of the city. The road narrowed as it wound toward Henry's house near Lake Walden. Smoke curled from the chimney when I arrived. He opened the door before I reached the steps, as if he'd been waiting. Inside, warmth wrapped around me. The house smelled of wood smoke and old books. He led me into a study lined with shelves and heavy oak furniture, poured coffee into two mismatched mugs, then sat across from me without wasting time. He said my father had been drowning in debt for years, that the company had survived on risky loans and hidden transfers, that he had warned him once, more than once, and been pushed out for it. My hands tightened around the mug as he spoke. When I asked what he meant by hidden transfers, Henry stood and opened a drawer. He pulled out a worn file folder and slid it across the desk toward me. The weight of it felt wrong in my hands. Inside were loan applications, refinancing documents, pages stamped and signed. I flipped through them slowly until I saw it. My name. My breath caught. My pulse roared in my ears. The signature at the bottom looked almost like mine, close enough to pass, close enough to destroy me. Henry told me that years earlier, my father had used my identity to secure a multi-million-dollar loan, claiming I was a silent partner who had agreed to back the company's expansion. He said he'd kept copies because he feared one day I'd need proof. The room tilted. I traced the forged letters with my finger, feeling sick. This wasn't just betrayal, it was theft. My father hadn't only humiliated me in public. He had stolen my name in private, used it as collateral. Years of building an independent life could vanish under ink I never touched. Henry leaned back and told me my father was desperate now, clinging to every asset he could reach, even the family house. I thought of my grandmother, of the trust she'd set up, of how she always said integrity mattered more than appearances. When I asked Henry what I should do, he told me not to confront my father yet. He said I needed evidence, legal counsel, and time. I nodded, but inside, something hardened. For years, I'd convinced myself that staying quiet was survival. Sitting there, staring at my stolen identity on paper, I finally understood the truth. Silence hadn't protected me. It had only made me easier to use. As I drove back toward the city, snow began to fall again, soft flakes blurring the road ahead. I pulled over and sat gripping the steering wheel, anger rising in waves. The slap had been humiliating, but this was dangerous. They had underestimated me for years. And they were still doing it now. When I reached my apartment, the city felt strangely distant, like I was moving through it behind glass. I laid the documents Henry had given me across the kitchen table, one by one. Each page carried my name, my signature, forged with terrifying precision. The weight of it settled slowly, not just fear, but fury, cold and focused. When Ethan, my husband, came home that evening, he knew something was wrong before I said a word. He listened without interrupting as I told him everything, the slap, the rumors. Henry's folder, the loans tied to my identity. His jaw tightened, but his voice stayed steady. He reminded me that this wasn't a family disagreement, it was a crime. Hearing it said out loud made my chest ache, but it also cleared something inside me. The next morning, we drove into downtown Boston to meet with a loan officer Ethan knew, someone willing to speak discreetly. The bank building smelled of carpet cleaner and ink, glass walls blurring conversations into shadows. As records appeared on the screen, my name surfaced again, and again, tied to loans I had never approved. A refinancing from 2 years earlier, another guarantee listed under my forged signature. My hands trembled as I leaned closer. It was close enough to pass, close enough to ruin me. Outside, the winter air hit my face like a shock. I had to stop on the sidewalk just to breathe. Ethan's arm wrapped around my shoulders, grounding me. Back home, we added the new documents to the growing pile. Fear still lingered, but beneath it was clarity. If my father could do this to me, there was no limit to what he'd justify. That evening, Megan came over. She brought coffee and quiet concern. When she saw the papers spread across the table, her expression changed. She squeezed my hand and said she was with me no matter what. Her loyalty felt unfamiliar and healing. Later, alone, I locked the documents into a small metal chest at the foot of my bed. It felt like sealing decades of denial inside steel. The following day, Megan arranged a meeting through her cousin who worked at the county records office in Hawthorne. The building was small, unremarkable, smelling faintly of dust and old paper. We were led into a narrow room lined with shelves. A thick binder was placed in front of me, my grandmother's probate file, untouched for years. As I turned the pages, my grandmother's handwriting stared back at me, firm, unmistakable. The trust was clear. The house could not be sold, mortgaged, or transferred without the consent of both grandchildren. Tears blurred my vision. Even in death, she had seen what I couldn't. She had protected me. Before we left, Megan's cousin slipped me a list of recent filings. Sitting in the car, I unfolded it and felt my blood run cold. 2 months before Christmas, there had been an attempted modification, naming my sister Clara as successor trustee. Quietly, deliberately. I had been erased on paper long before Christmas night. That night, Ethan and I sat at the kitchen table, papers spread between us, the heater humming softly. He told me this was too big to handle alone, that he knew an attorney who specialized in estate fraud and identity theft. Part of me hesitated, the old instinct to keep things private, to avoid escalation. Then I thought of the slap, the laughter, the forged signatures, the lies spreading through town. Silence had never protected me. The next morning, we walked into a sleek office downtown and met Daniel Ross, an attorney with calm eyes and a precise voice. I laid out everything. Henry's documents, the bank records, the trust. He reviewed them carefully, then looked up and said what I already knew. With this evidence, we could freeze any transfer of the house and prepare for a fraud case. Once the papers were filed, he warned, there would be no controlling the fallout. My father would fight, the town would talk. As we stepped back into the cold air, fear still coiled in my chest, but it no longer ruled me. This wasn't revenge. It was survival. And for the first time in my life, I was done shrinking. The paperwork moved faster than I expected. Within days, the emergency motion was filed, an injunction to freeze any transfer of the Moore house until the court could review the trust. When I read the stamped notice, my hands shook, not with fear this time, but with the weight of what it meant. Once those papers were served, nothing my parents had hidden behind polished smiles could stay buried. By mid-morning, Megan called me. Her voice was tight, controlled. She said the sheriff had been at the house, that my father had shouted loud enough for neighbors to hear, that my mother was already telling anyone who would listen that I was trying to destroy the family. Clara, she said, went straight for the deepest cut, telling people I was bitter because I couldn't have children, that this was my way of punishing them. The familiar cruelty settled in my chest like a bruise that never fully healed. The days that followed blurred together. At work, conversations softened when I entered a room. Some people avoided eye contact, others offered careful sympathy. In Hawthorne, whispers multiplied, old neighbors crossed the street instead of waving. Strangers looked at me with curiosity sharpened by judgment. I reminded myself that this was the cost of truth even when loneliness pressed hard at night. A few evenings later, as I was leaving work, I saw Daniel waiting near the entrance. Clara's fiancé looked smaller than before, his shoulders slumped, his confidence gone. Against my better judgment, I agreed to talk. We sat on a bench near the frozen river, the wind cutting through our coats. He said he tried to warn them, that my father and Clara wouldn't listen. Then his voice dropped. He admitted he had seen documents the year before, accounts my father kept overseas, wire transfers that didn't add up, and my name appearing again, tied to balances I had never touched. He said he'd stayed silent out of fear of losing Clara, fear of standing alone. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I told him quietly that if he had proof, it needed to come forward. Words alone wouldn't stop what was already in motion. He slid an envelope across the bench. Inside were photocopies of transfers and account records. My name repeated like a stain. I felt the world narrow around me. At home, Ethan read the pages slowly, his expression darkening with each one. He said this could mean more than civil fraud, it could mean tax violations, wire fraud, identity theft on a scale that would draw federal attention. The thought tightened my chest. Part of me recoiled at what this would mean for my parents, another part knew there was no turning back. When we met with Daniel Ross again and placed the envelope on his desk, he didn't hesitate. He said this evidence changed everything. Introducing it would escalate the case beyond probate court, into criminal territory. He explained each step carefully, each consequence. I nodded and told him to proceed. The first hearing arrived on a bitterly cold morning. The courtroom was small, crowded with familiar faces. My parents sat at the front, my mother's posture rigid, pearls catching the light. My father's jaw clenched tight with defiance. Clara sat between them, arms folded, her certainty flickering for the first time. As the judge entered, silence fell. Daniel presented the trust documents calmly, explained their meaning with precision. When my father stood and declared the house was his, that I had abandoned the family, the judge stopped him with a raised hand. The law, she said, did not support his belief. The injunction was granted. As the gavel struck, something shifted in the room. The power that had always seemed to belong to my father loosened. Clara brushed past me as we left and hissed that this wasn't over. I met her eyes steadily and said nothing. For once, silence belonged to me. The weeks leading to the final hearing felt longer than the years that came before them. More evidence surfaced quietly, bank records, signatures, dates that lined up too perfectly to deny. Whispers in Hawthorne changed tone. Some people avoided me out of embarrassment, others reached out with apologies they didn't quite know how to phrase. I accepted neither fully. I was too tired for explanations. Daniel sent one last message, warning me that my father was still trying to move money, shifting accounts, acting as if motion alone might save him. Each new attempt only confirmed what I already knew, the truth wasn't slowing him down, it was cornering him. By the time the final hearing arrived, I was exhausted but clear. I wasn't fighting to be seen as a good daughter anymore. I was fighting to protect my name, my future, and the legacy my grandmother had trusted me with. The morning was gray and bitter, the kind of cold that settles into your bones. I stood outside the courthouse with Ethan beside me, my gloves clenched in one hand, a folder of documents in the other. Inside, the benches filled quickly, neighbors, former business associates, distant relatives, drawn by the gravity of what was about to unfold. My parents took their seats at the front. My mother sat rigid, her composure practiced and fragile. My father looked older than I remembered, his confidence strained, his defiance tight around the edges. Clara sat beside them, her certainty flickering, fear leaking through the cracks. When the judge entered, the room narrowed. Daniel spoke slowly, clearly, laying out the facts not as family drama, but as a pattern. He began with my grandmother's trust, reminding the court that her intentions were explicit, designed to protect the house from exactly this kind of manipulation. Then came the loans, the forged signatures, the wire transfers. My name repeated again and again. Each document entered into record felt like another layer of denial being peeled away. My father shifted in his seat, color draining from his face, then rushing back in anger. When the judge asked if he had anything to say, he stood. His voice was loud, but unsteady. He spoke of betrayal, of abandonment, of a daughter who had turned her back on her family. The judge listened without interruption, then responded calmly. The law, she said, did not bend to wounded pride. The trust was binding, and the evidence showed a clear pattern of fraud. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. My mother stared straight ahead, her hands white around her purse. Clara looked down, her bravado gone. The ruling was final. The house would remain frozen under the trust. An independent forensic review of the business would begin immediately. Federal authorities would be notified regarding identity theft and financial fraud. When the gavel struck, I didn't feel triumph. I felt release. Outside, the cold air filled my lungs, sharp and clean. Ethan took my hand, his grip steady, grounding me in the present. For the first time in decades, I felt like I was standing on solid ground. The weeks that followed were quiet in an unfamiliar way. My father resigned from his company. My parents withdrew from public life. Clara and Daniel left town without ceremony. Their certainty, their cruelty, faded into absence. I didn't celebrate their downfall. What I felt was balance returning. Justice doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives as peace. One Saturday, I drove out to the Oldmore house. The porch sagged slightly, paint peeling in places, but the tall pine in the yard stood strong, unchanged. I rested my hand on the railing and whispered a thank you to my grandmother. Her foresight had protected me when I couldn't protect myself. Megan joined me there with coffee, smiling softly. Ethan wrapped his arms around my shoulders as we looked out over the quiet yard. The storm had passed. I finally understood something simple and hard-earned. Standing up for yourself doesn't make you cruel. It makes you honest. Courage doesn't begin with shouting. It begins the moment you stop shrinking. And that was where my story truly ended, and finally, began.